Okay, we are going live. Hello. Everybody, how's it going? We're back for our bi-weekly live stream. Right now, Brianna and I just put our son down to bed, so he's still getting to sleep. So you might hear the baby monitor. I hope you guys don't mind. But he's sad he's missing the live stream. Let me click shares here. I don't know if we have any. Omar, hey, how's it going? Good to see you. Volunteering for the NDP this weekend. Love to see that. Great to see. I mean, volunteering, man, it's like the value you add. Like, you think, like, especially for the NDP, because, you know, we're not really a party with money, even in the best of times. We're not a party of wealthy people. So, you know that, like, every hour you can give to your local candidate or to the party or what have you, it pays off like in multiples. So I think that's great to see. You know, any way you can contribute to the NDP, contribute to progressive causes in your community, it's fantastic. Can't ask for anything more than that. Because again, like, you give somebody a few hours a week, you know, even at, you know, minimum wage, that's worth dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of dollars over a campaign. And, you know, it's something that anybody can contribute, and they can do whatever they want. So, like, not everyone's a big phone person. Not everyone's a big knocking on doors person. But, you know, there's always room for people to contribute. So I'm happy to see that. Happy to see that. All thanks to you. Well, I don't know about that, but I'm glad to have helped. If I've gotten you to given a little bit of time to the NDP, then I'm happy to hear about it, and I'm happy to see it. So for those who don't know, Brianna is here. Brianna, do you want to say hi to people? Brianna there. Again, Brianna, I have asked Brianna if she would like to be on camera, and right now she has suggested she is not ready for that. But in the near future, she might well come on camera, and this would be kind of like a co-hosted show where we both take questions. Maybe we would, you know, take a bit of an opening segment where it's more of like a podcast, but we're not sure about that yet. But but rest assured, Brianna will be here at least most of the time to help me co-host the podcast. Yes, and you can see Brianna has left a comment. That's great to see. Can you hear that on the thing? Yeah. But yeah, a couple other things I'm going to get into. Bernie 2020, 100%. I agree. A couple other things. I'll note this later on in the podcast as well, or on the live stream as well. Sorry. Not next week, but starting with my next live stream, which is 2 weeks from tonight, because I do them every second Wednesday, I will be going weekly until the election. So every Wednesday, starting on 2 weeks from now, from that Wednesday to the Wednesday following the federal election, I will be doing this weekly. And after that, we'll reevaluate. Maybe I'll switch back to a bi-weekly schedule. But because there'll be so much more news on the Canadian front, but also on the American front, and now with Britain, there's a lot of exciting news there. I'm sure you guys will have lots of questions. I'm sure I'll have a lot to say. So if you guys want to come by weekly on Wednesdays at 8 p.m., starting later on this month and running till the end of the federal election, which should be, give or take, on about the 21st of October, we'll be doing a weekly live stream.
So Jagmeet Singh says that he appreciates your content, but regardless of election realities, they'll be dedicating most of their political activity towards supporting the Communist Party.
Well, I mean, look, at the end of the day, at least you're not voting Liberal or Green, right? Or PPC or what have you, or the Conservatives. Like the Communist Party probably aligns most closely with my views than most parties. So good on you. Best of luck. I know that it's tricky because not every riding has a Communist Party candidate. So, I know it's sometimes it's like, well, you have an option for a communist candidate in some parts of the country, but not others. So I can't fault you for working for the party you believe in, even if we don't have the same party. I know we probably share a lot of the same ideals, and I think that matters.
Why don't you comment about the Hassan Minhaj interview that you did today?
Yeah, I mean, today actually, I wanted to post it on YouTube. One of the things I do in addition to YouTube is I do a lot of mainstream media appearances, sometimes on talk radio. And a lot of them are recorded, and I have posted them on YouTube before because I feel like they sometimes touch on issues I don't touch on directly on the channel, but the quality isn't great. So I did this interview today talking about Hassan Minhaj and his interview with Justin Trudeau and what that meant and how it was a tough interview and how in some ways Minhaj held Trudeau to account more than Canada's real deal journalists have over the past 3 or 4 years. So that didn't go up, but if you guys have any questions about that or comments about that, I'd love to hear them. And let me know what you think. I mean, some outlets don't let me post my interviews. For example, some news outlets, I'm not naming and shaming, they have copyright issues and they don't let me rehost my interviews on this channel. But other sources are fine with it as long as I give credit to them. So let me know what you think about me reposting that. I don't feel bad doing it because it's content that I can't think that most of you will see otherwise, because a lot of it's for like talk radio or traditional news, and it's a very different audience from YouTube. And a lot of the times the content is live. Sometimes it's available for recording, but it's like, by putting it on YouTube, it keeps all of my stuff in one central place. So like that's one of the things that I've been thinking about. So let me know what you guys think about that. Talking about my regular media appearances. Generally, when there's an election or anything like that, I'll be in the mainstream media a little bit more. Whether it's doing comments for journalists, like they need a quote for their article, or whether it's to do a radio hit or a TV hit or what have you. You might see me on the CTV or the CBC or in various print media. And if I can, I'll translate that to YouTube as best I can.
So we're just coming off the long weekend, which is Labor Day, of course. Do you want to talk a little bit about, the importance of Labor Day and why it's important for people to go out and actually participate?
Yeah, I mean, Brianna raises a great point. For those who Brianna basically said, like, Labor Day, why is Labor Day still important? And it's not just because, it's the long weekend before school. And it's not just because it's the day after which you must not wear white. Labor Day is, this special day that commemorates the struggle of working people. And that struggle is not just this thing in the past, although the history is important. I'm a labor historian. I know that. But I realize that it's also about the struggles that are ongoing. The continued struggle for fair wages and safe workplaces and economic democracy and equality, and security for working people, and how every Labor Day we sort of cherish the past, but also look forward to a better future. So I don't know if any of you guys went to Labor Day parades or Labor Day picnics across Ontario and Canada. I know that for those of you who are not in Canada and the USA, you don't really have Labor Day. You most likely celebrate May Day, May 1st. In Canada and the USA, Labor Day was created in the 1800s, and it was created to be distinct from May Day. Part of the reason being that May Day was associated with the socialist movement in a more direct manner, whereas Labor Day was more of a kind of creation by the state to recognize workers, but distancing it from May Day itself. So there's a complicated history. In Canada, May Day is still celebrated, but by much smaller amounts of people, often because it's not recognized as a statutory holiday in which you get the day off of work, and it's not combined into a long weekend and all of that. And as you guys know, I made one of my recent videos was about how Justin Trudeau tried to come to Labor Day in Hamilton, but was poorly received by the workers there, who I think were right to note that Justin Trudeau has not really been a friend of workers over his government. And I think that was very good to see, because too many union leaders have been very soft with Trudeau, have been very, grovelly to Trudeau. And it was good to see rank and file Hamilton steel workers and other workers tell Trudeau where he does and doesn't belong, and he doesn't belong in Hamilton. That was really great to see.
Of course, that wasn't how it was reported by the Hamilton press, but
yeah, I don't know if you guys saw that. You saw my video. I talked about this on social media. They made the case that these were hijackers trying to ruin the parade, when really it was led by working class people and some of the unions in Hamilton, the people who were at every Labor Day, and then also Indigenous protesters who were, like Labor, were promised so much by this government, but have been given so little. And there was a great alliance of solidarity between the postal workers and Indigenous people defending those at Grassy Narrows who are struggling at getting basic necessities like clean drinking water. And it was really powerful.
Okay. So we have a question here from Ash HB. She says, do you think Canada would ever consider becoming a republic?
That's an interesting one. My perspective is that at least right now, likely not. As long as the Queen's alive, it's a non-starter because the Queen remains somewhat popular. I think a lot of people feel like it would be disrespectful to start those conversations while she was alive. And I think that even if you've done polling, not to say that Republicanism polls well, but it polls better under say, Prince Charles as king versus Queen Elizabeth as the monarch. So I think that's the first step. The reality with Canada as well is that many of our constitutional reforms require the 750 rule, which is 7 out of the 10 provinces minimum, representing 50% of the population minimum. And so for most constitutional reform, you have a pretty high bar to get over. But for things like abolishing the monarchy, it's been suggested that it requires provincial unanimity, which means that every province's legislature must agree. And I just don't know if the cards will ever line up that all 10 provinces will agree to abolish the monarchy at the same time. I don't know if that's going to happen. Now, one thing to note, and it hasn't affected us because we're separate in a way, but, abolish the monarchy was trending in England, trending in Britain, when the Queen just allowed Boris Johnson to sort of try to prorogue Parliament, in a unilateral fashion. And of course, the Queen has to be very careful about how she uses her powers. But one of the arguments from monarchists for a monarch is that she's very rarely political, but when she is, it's necessary. And a lot of people felt the Queen should have known that was a moment to do that. And there's been other times where, governor generals and the Queen and monarchs have flexed their muscle, and that should have been one of those moments. And a lot of people felt the Queen failed to do her job there. And some people are suggesting, well, why do we need a monarch if they won't protect us from people like Boris Johnson in these crucial moments? And maybe that's fair, or maybe that's unfair to the Queen, but that was a kind of tension. So I think what would likely happen is that the monarchy's probably good for now because Prince Charles isn't popular, but even if he does get to be king, he's already a pretty old man himself. He's already he's getting close to 80, he must be, right? He's in his 70s at least. And, the next generation of the monarchy is much more popular and I think much more in touch, as much as hereditary billionaires can be.
So Davy Labor asks, what are the best sources to debunk the Greens? I can't convince my significant other not to vote for them. She usually flips between them and the NDP.
Well, the best source to debunk the Greens are things written and said by the Greens. Share this information for them. Share how Elizabeth May, for example, a few years back, basically wanted to support depopulation in Africa. What was in effect a form of eugenics. Send me a note via email or Facebook or Twitter, and I can try to dig up that source for you. I can't find that right now, obviously. But that wasn't that long ago. That effectively there was almost this sort of thing where the Greens, we have to depopulate the world. Let's start where non-white people live. And that's a Green Party policy. We could talk about how, look at one of their new recruits from New Brunswick, the video I made just last night, how they basically said, we can't organize in New Brunswick under the NDP because Jagmeet Singh has a different race and religion from this people. We can't do it. We're going to go with a party that has a white leader. That's what one of the 14 essentially said. Now, Greens have come out and said that's out of context, blah, 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 blah. I don't think it is. I think that captures the view of the highest profile new Green defector. And it's also in line with what Pierre Nantel has said, which is that he doesn't think Jagmeet Singh can win because of his turban and his race. And so he went to a party that, doesn't have a man of color, but rather a white woman who wears a very open crucifix. All of these things are things the Green Party has done. You might also note that the Green Party is anti-worker. That their policies are ignorant at best of workers. You might also note, look up journalist Robert Jago. I'm not sure if it's Jago or Yago, Jago. He's an indigenous journalist and commentator who has done some work about the Green Party's ignorance at best about indigenous people. And then you might also note that the Green Party supports a tar sand pipeline. Elizabeth May supports tar sand pipelines. She wants to support the Alberta tar sand industry. These are all supposedly things the Green Party of progressives they wouldn't back, but they do. Their slogan is not left, not right, but forward, which is to say that in a world where you have good left-wing people like Bernie Sanders and the alt-right crazies like Donald Trump, the Green Party says they're both bad, I'm right up the middle, which is a deeply troubling false equivalency. The Green Party's biggest enemy is the Green Party. And I know the media has a vested interest right now in trying to suggest that they're supplanting the NDP, which I do not think is true. Only one pollster right now shows them ahead of the NDP, and that pollster is an outlier. The reality is that if the media does their job in this election, the Green Party will crash and burn because they have awful ideas and they have awful candidates and they have an awful leader. And I'm done playing nice with the Green Party, folks. I'm sorry. The fact that they went to the racism well 2 times in the last month to poach NDP candidates. I mean, I'm glad those people are gone, but my goodness, that's the Green Party. That's the party. That's the Green Party. It's a party of pipelines. It's a party that opposes the rights of workers. It's a party that wants to commit eugenics in Africa. And it's a party that will, if they're not racist, then they will use racism as a justification to put Elizabeth May above Jagmeet Singh. Done with the Greens. That's the biggest thing. Those are the biggest things that you can go. Just use the Greens' own stuff against them.
Okay. Dan Mandel says, please make a video on the dangers of the Canadian National Party given it's an official party, i.e. Germany 1936.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly been looking up. And Dan, thank you for sending me the info. And I mean, it was related to the person who I think heckled Guru Tan Singh. I made a video. I think he is connected to that movement, at least indirectly. I know he leads a national organization, which I believe is affiliated. And I think I certainly probably will be talking about this a little bit more. I mean, I think the PPC has gotten more of my attention. But you're right in noting that this is a very interesting development. And it's been very complicated because this group wants to be seen as an official party. But a lot of the people associated don't want to be revealed. They sort of know that people are going to not be very kind to their views and their party. And as they become an official party, they have to become much more transparent about who they are, where their money comes from, what their membership looks like, and on and on and on and on. And I think as we see them become more formalized, I'm going to have more information. So, I probably will at some point dig into them. Maybe for this election, when I talk about the right, it'll probably be more focused on Scheer and Bernier. But yeah, they're definitely on my radar.
Okay. Omar asks, won't not going to 3 out of 5 debates leave Trudeau vulnerable to being attacked?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a couple things there. For Omar makes a great point. This was reported in La Presse today, which is one of the big French-Canadian newspapers, online sources. I don't believe they're in print anymore, but one of the historic papers from Quebec reported that Trudeau will only attend 2 of the 5 debates. Now, there's the 2 official debates, one in French and one in English, and then there's an additional Monk debate on foreign policy. There's a Maclean's debate, and then there's an additional French debate on TVA, one of the French networks, leading to 2 French and 3 English debates. Trudeau is skipping all but the 2 official debates. He said that, it's because he doesn't want to have an imbalance in French and English. But I think the bigger factor, as that article noted and as my video noted, Trudeau just doesn't see any upside. will it hurt him? I don't know. It doesn't look good. But what if the debates don't go forward without him? Then does he get hit because of it? And that's an interesting question. So, for instance, the debates are still planned, and I assume that the plan right now is to go ahead without Trudeau. But what happens if, say, Andrew Scheer doesn't want to participate because Justin Trudeau's not there? And so now, are you going to have a debate with just May and Singh and Blanchette from the Bloc? I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, but would they do that? Would they cancel it if multiple leaders didn't show up, right? And so it creates this scenario where, will Trudeau be punished? I think the story hasn't looked good for him, but will Canadians remember that when we go to the polls? And Trudeau's internal calculus, his party's calculus, is that the risk of having one of these debates is greater than the blowback for not going to one of the debates. And I don't know if he's right or wrong. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, one of the arguments the Liberals have made is that last debate, TVA's debate, would be scheduled tentatively for October 16th, which is 5 days from October 21st, which is when people expect the election to happen. And if such is the case, I think Trudeau is afraid of having a lead and then blowing it with 5 days left. And I think a factor, and I noted in my video, is that Jagmeet Singh has a lot of great ideas, and Canadians don't know him. NDP policies are popular, but Canadians don't know Jagmeet Singh, and the NDP is often starved for media attention. And I think Trudeau is not so much worried about Andrew Scheer. He's worried about Jagmeet Singh. And if he stands on 5 different stages with Singh, and Singh gets to introduce himself to Canadians and promote the NDP's progressive policies that are not only popular, but that contextualize Trudeau's neoliberal centrism, then I feel that he might lose some support from NDPers who have gone to him over the past months. And I think that's what scares him. Will it work or not? I'm not sure. But if they go ahead with the debates, I mean, it might look really bad for Trudeau, because you know what they'll often do? I know locally, when local, say, conservative or liberal candidates don't show up to our labor-themed debates, Brianna was the organizer of a labor-themed debate back in the 2015 election. We actually had chairs for the non-attendees with their names there. So I can only imagine of, let's say TVA or Maclean's or the Monk Institute has a podium empty where Justin Trudeau should be standing. I think that optic alone would not look good for him.
What if they put a paper cutout there?
They could put a paper cutout, but imagine even if the podium's there, Scheer and Singh and May and Blanchette could still, in a sense, attack Trudeau, and Trudeau wouldn't be there to defend himself. I don't think it's a good move, but who knows? Without the Prime Minister there, those sources.
Okay. Andrei Borsnenko, is there any emphasis on art funding for you, the NDP, during this election or generally? I don't hear much from left voices. Also, what is the current historical role of artists? I think most left art funding has come from unions.
Yeah, groups. In terms of general, say, social science, humanities, funding, a lot of that does come from the federal government. One of the things the Liberals did is they did reverse some of the Harper cuts, or stop some of the Harper cuts to those institutes, which is a good thing. Again, somebody have asked me, what are some good things the Liberals have done? And I mentioned the census. They haven't hacked and slashed at the funding agencies. In terms of arts funding, you're right. That's not really getting a lot of play. And I don't know if I think there's an opportunity there, because the original New Deal had arts programs as part of it, right? You can look this up. FDR's original New Deal hired artists and photographers and journalists to, in a sense, to propagandize the project, but it also created work for a certain sort of intellectual and creative class. And I don't see why, a Green New Deal for the 21st century can't include art and artists and creative types. And maybe that's a bit of a blind spot in the NDP's platform. I think that's a great point. It's not something I've thought about enough, frankly, and I have to go back to the drawing board and think about it.
Okay, sorry, one sec. None Your Business says the Green Party is desperate for sure. She still doesn't regret voting for Jill 16 though, which is interesting because we've seen some really great progressive Green Party candidates in Kingston. So what does it say when you have an incredibly progressive local candidate and this emerging rhetoric of conservatism coming from the Greens?
Yeah, I mean, the Green Party, by virtue of its image in Canada, attracts a certain type of person. And sometimes that verges on the conspiratorial, but often it verges on the idealistic. The Green Party is a party that, at least ostensively, we've never really been able to test it because they've never really had like a big caucus. Now, PEI might be the first test where the Green Party actually has like a caucus. But the Green Party has said, look, we don't whip votes. The Green Party has said our members can believe what they want. Our MPs can do what they want. The Green Party has this vision, at least this image, at least, of being supportive of the environment and being socially progressive, but and I think that's why they attract a lot of these candidates, but I don't know if the broad ideology is there. And I think one important thing to note is if you say you don't regret voting for Jill Stein in the United States for president, I don't think that's unreasonable. I mean, I don't know what I would have done. I probably would have voted for Clinton, with the biggest, clothespin on my nose ever designed by man, but I probably would have. But I don't begrudge anybody who didn't vote for her because she didn't do enough to earn their votes. She didn't get enough of people to Pokemon go to the polls. The point is, like, the Green Party in Canada is a fairly conservative Green Party, at least federally. I know it is in Ontario. It is in BC. I don't know about the smaller Green Parties in provinces where they don't have a lot of seats. But the Green Parties in Europe often have very progressive values. So I don't want to judge all capital G Green Parties with the same brush. But the Green Party in Canada leaves me very much wanting. And there's also veins of anti-vaxxer theories within certain elements of the Green Party. And you hear things like this every now and then that are off-putting. And here in Canada, there are good Greens that arrived at the Green Party for whatever reason. But on the whole, I'm not a fan of the party and what it stands for at the highest ideological level. I know in Kingston, this is a thing. Migration between the Greens and the NDP in Kingston is a common thing, both ways. Greens to the NDP and NDP to Greens. But I don't know if that has anything to do with the ideological bases of the party and more just how people see these parties on a surface level.
Well, and I think they respond to local candidates.
And I think that's a good point. That's a great point.
Okay, just reorganizing some of your questions here, guys. Homegrown politics, because we're talking about the Greens, says your accusations by the Green Party are super offensive, and they want evidence on it, particularly the foreign policy claim. And I think the article you're referring to is a 2015 Vice article, which references the Green Policy Book for population reduction.
Yeah, so we'll definitely take a look. So check that out with what Brianna is saying. The Green Party has said something along those lines. Again, I've said I'd provide a specific source if somebody sent me a question. My claim there is not wrong. It's not wrong. The Green Party has said some awful things. And they've justified, they have new candidates now. They have a former NDP MP, a former NDP MP, and a former NDP national executive member who have not fully, but in part, suggested that one of the reasons the NDP is failing is because of the leader's skin tone and religion, and that they've used that in part, I feel, to at least implicitly justify their departure. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. The Liberal Party does not even do that. I'm sorry. I know I have fans here who are Green Party members and supporters and sympathetic too, but the Green Party has some real skeletons in their closet, recent and longer term. Look, we could spend another video talking about Elizabeth May and her position on a women's right to choose. It is less clear than it should be.
Okay, John Doe 6171 says, "Hey Christo, are you planning to stream during the upcoming Canadian debates and give your live commentary?" I don't know if you could contain yourself well enough to do that.
I don't know about doing a live stream. One, I don't know if this would affect Canada, but during the American debates, a lot of the channels, they didn't just get demonetized, but they got hit with copyright claims for live streaming the debate. Now, I don't know if in Canada the rules are the same, or if they're different, or if they're more lenient, or they're more harsh. So right off the bat, I would have to look that up, to live stream the entire debate, even with commentary overlay. This was a big deal. This was a big deal during the American debates. If you look up David Pakman and a lot of these people, they got dinged for streaming it, I think, on Twitch and or YouTube. Most likely what I'll do is when the debates do happen, I'll probably go live pretty much as soon as they're done and offer my recap. And that's likely what I'll do. Sort of like a one-man spin room. Brianna might be there for those or might not be, but that'll probably be my take. And I did something similar for some of the previous American debates, where after they ended, I jumped on YouTube for a live stream, took some questions, offered some brief comments. So I'm definitely planning on doing at least that again.
Okay. So Joshua Hunt says, oh, hey, Joshua. Do you feel like the Canadian election isn't covered that much and Trudeau will probably win a majority because of it?
I don't know if that's the case. I do think that the election, I mean, we're sort of in election mode, but what happens with Canada is that we're like, we really do cram that election coverage in. Like with the last Ontario election, there was coverage just like there is now, but it's like when it starts, like everything is election. And I'm guessing that starting later this week, early next week, for basically a month and a bit, it's going to be wall-to-wall election stuff here in Canada. So I'm not too worried about that. I'm more worried about the nature of the coverage, the balance of the coverage, than I am about a particular, amount of coverage. And in terms of Trudeau winning a majority, I'm not sure. I mean, the aggregates right now show the Conservatives and Liberals effectively tied, but the Liberals having an advantage because they have good numbers in Ontario and Quebec. I mean, some pollsters are suggesting the Liberals are close to a majority, but I think that if the numbers hold firm, the Liberals will be in first place, but short of a majority, and will likely need the NDP to hold the balance of power, in the next legislature, in the next parliament. Now, will low coverage help the Prime Minister? I'm not sure. On the one hand, historically at least, low turnout benefits the incumbent. When there's low turnout, some people suggest it's because more people don't care, and that generally means they're not so angry at the government that they're going to make sure they're going to come out and vote against it. So low turnout is often good for incumbents, but low turnout is often good for conservatives, for like not just Canadian conservatives, but for right of center parties, because their populations vote sort of no matter what. When turnout is high, it means young people and marginalized people are coming out. Old people always vote, and old people largely vote conservative. And so if there's low turnout because there's like low enthusiasm, maybe you say the media coverage is insufficient or it's not as heavy as it could be, does that help the incumbent Liberals or the Conservatives? And I'm not sure. Last time, it's important to note that most of the pollsters missed the Liberal majority. They projected the Liberals in first, most pollsters, but not in a majority. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. The first reason is that the Liberal trend was rather quickly going upwards. And that if the election happened 2 days earlier type thing, they would have won, but with a minority. And 2 days later, the majority might have even been more massive. Like they were on an upward swing. And pollsters can only do so much to cover very quick movements in the population. And another factor is I don't think the pollsters captured the enthusiasm of young people and Indigenous people who both voted way more often than they normally do. And whether or not we like it, they like Trudeau and they believed him. A lot of them are disappointed now. And so what happens if those populations, maybe they go to Jagmeet Singh and the NDP or the Greens or what have you, but what happens if they just don't vote? They go back to not voting. And that could hurt Justin Trudeau. Maybe it's the difference between him winning or losing, or between him getting a majority or minority. Honestly, beyond that, I can't answer the question, but there is volatility right now. That's for sure.
Okay, John Doe 6171 says Trudeau not being in all the debates may help the NDP by giving Jagmeet more opportunity to speak, present his ideas, and be the only one with progressive rhetoric on the stage.
I certainly think that's a possibility. I wonder, like, the dynamics of those debates will be very interesting because, you know, the prime minister is the focal point, right? They're the focal point of attacks. And so Justin Trudeau would be attacked by Andrew Scheer for various reasons and Jagmeet Singh for various reasons. Elizabeth May is usually more cozy with Trudeau, but she might try to attack him on environmental issues. And then, you know, there's all of these things that Justin Trudeau would have to handle. And if Justin Trudeau is off the stage, well, what happens? Does Elizabeth May attack the Conservatives, or does she go after Jagmeet Singh, sensing weakness? And does Jagmeet Singh attack Elizabeth May, seeing that he can use this opportunity to push back her advances in southwestern British Columbia on the island and what have you? Or does he go after Andrew Scheer, trying to carve out ABC voters away from the Liberals to himself? And honestly, like, I don't know how that's going to happen. I can envision more or less what a debate would look like with Trudeau in it. Without him there, there's a whole bunch of wild cards. And again, we have to operate under the possibility that while these companies, while these debate organizers say they want to continue with or without the prime minister, I don't know if they're just trying to call the prime minister's bluff and maybe hope Trudeau changes his mind. And then if he doesn't, they'll cancel. I really don't know. But I do agree, at least hypothetically, that will give a real opening for Jagmeet Singh to become seen as the definitive anti-Scheer voice on the stage. And it helps that while May has been unclear at best about would she prop up Andrew Scheer, what would it take for her to prop him up, etc., Jagmeet Singh has come out and said no alliance with Andrew Scheer. His views on certain issues are so bad that the NDP cannot cooperate with him. And I think a lot of progressive Canadians wanted to hear that. And on that stage, without Trudeau there, Singh might have more credibility as the anti-Scheer option when, you know, presented to Canadians.
Okay, Andrei Borisenko, Jesse Brown is loud against the media bailout. Haven't heard much about it elsewhere. Thoughts on the bailout and what, if anything, should be done regarding media on government level?
I mean, Jesse Brown, I think, raises some important concerns that the transparency of the process is less than needed. And here's the thing: whether or not the process is biased, and whether or not the process is broken, and whether or not the process privileges a certain ideology over another, or whether the process privileges a certain form of media over another, aka traditional print and TV media versus new digital media, and be it podcasts or YouTube or online only news websites. Those are, whether or not any of that bias is real or imagined. If it is sufficiently imagined, I think Brown is right in noting that this is sort of dangerous because it gives more credence to the fake news alarmists. It gives them something to hug to. And people like Jerry Diaz, if I'm being honest, aren't being helpful here. Jerry Diaz, Unifor has effectively been given a spot on this board. And I understand why, because Unifor does represent media workers. But then combining that with their openly anti-Andrew Scheer stance has given incredible amounts of ammunition to Andrew Scheer to effectively say that whenever there's bad press about Andrew Scheer or good press about Justin Trudeau, that it's the $600 million media bailout. You know, Jesse Brown suggested, and I'm not a big fan of like consumer tax credits. I feel like it's such a neoliberal form of wonkery. But he suggested what the government should have done is give generous tax credits to those who subscribe to media. If you subscribe to a newspaper or a podcast or whatever, you should get a tax credit to help defer the cost, almost like a charitable donation. And that way you recognize that media plays a role in our society, but you're not choosing for people. Now, the controversies could arise, well, like what media is eligible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the very least, it would be like whether you're a left-wing person and you want to send money to, like, you know, Ricochet, you know, the online publication, or whether you want to send your money to, the Toronto Sun, you will get a tax credit. I mean, that's an option, almost like how political parties are funded. Now, like in terms of the general sense of like what that means, I mean, I'm generally, excuse me, guys, excuse me. I'm generally in favor of this idea that media has value beyond a private enterprise. And so that if there are ways that we can find a way to, through public means, support media, I'm all there for it. But I have to feel that the way this has been done has, from at least an optics perspective, been really bungled by Trudeau and his team.
Okay. Do you need a tissue?
I'm okay.
Okay. Ben McGuinness says McGuinness says it's very disappointing that the NDP is pro-pipeline and fracking.
I mean, the NDP's position on pipelines is region dependent. And I know that's not a good enough answer. And I've been critical of Rachel Notley and some other provincial NDPs. Jagmeet Singh has been quite clear. He is not going to use any fossil fuel subsidies. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to ban pipelines. And I can say that maybe that doesn't go far enough. But it goes farther than every other party. And again, I think Jagmeet Singh is maybe more opposed to tar sand pipelines than Elizabeth May, or at least that's up for debate. Now, the question on fracking is very interesting. The federal party in recent months has taken a stronger stance, but if we're being honest, the BC NDP supports fracking. And these are difficult questions we have to ask ourselves on the left is how do we build a coherent eco-socialist message in a federal system? And the problem with that is that there are different interests and different perspectives even within one political party at its various regions. And I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer to solving that. All I can say is that I think the NDP has the best climate plan. Because let's be real. The Green Party in BC controls the balance of power. And they have used that balance of power against the NDP. For example, the NDP wasn't allowed to raise the minimum wage as fast because the Green Party, in part, had concerns about its effects on business. And the NDP wanted to make it easier for workers to unionize, and the Green Party opposed that. They said that they would vote against the government on those issues. But the Green Party has not forced the NDP to cancel Site C. And the Green Party has not forced the British Columbia NDP to move away from things like fracking. They haven't. They have the power to do so, and they haven't, which effectively means that Site C and fracking are Green Party policies in BC now. They've endorsed them. If they're so confident that those are anti-green policies, then they should pull the government down and send BC to an election and run on those policies. Because otherwise, the Greens have shown in BC, which is the only place in the country thus far where they've had any meaningful power, because in PEI, the government's too young there to really get a sense. They've shown that the Greens will flex their muscle to stop wage increases and unionization, but they will not flex their muscles to fight Site C and fracking. And I don't know what that says. I don't think it looks good. And I think what it does say is that, and this is bad, but like if no party is good on fracking and good on pipelines, the crappy answer is, well, who's the least worst? And maybe it's a political party that doesn't have any seats. Maybe it's maybe it's the Communist Party. Maybe it's a party that doesn't have the ability to win seats under the current structure of our government. But it does mean I feel that the NDP offers the best approach towards a green future. Although I will admit it is imperfect and some of the policies leave me and other progressives wanting.
John Doe 6171. How do you feel about the LCBO and the privatization of alcohol sales in Ontario? To me, it's crazy that alcohol is more publicly owned than healthcare in Ontario, as in the government sells alcohol but doesn't even cover dental.
I mean, I think we need both. I support public dental. I mean, Andrew Horwath ran on that in the last election. I supported that. I generally support the public ownership of the alcohol industry for a few reasons. One, it provides good unionized jobs in big cities and small towns all around this province. It better allows the revenues to stay in the public coffer. And as we know, alcohol has pretty significant social and medical costs. So at the very least, I don't think we can ban alcohol. You know, I'm not a prohibitionist. So it's like, if you're going to need the public revenues to keep it in-house. I think that, you know, if anything, we need to approach with greater public ownership. I think the beer store the beer store monopoly should be ended, but not like Doug Ford wants to do it. I think the beer store should be folded into the LCBO system and owned by the public instead of by, beer conglomerations. And I'm not opposed to beer and wine and even liquor sales in grocery stores as long as there are kiosks that are run by LCBO staff. And I wouldn't mind if in every grocery store in this province, big cities, small towns, 24 hours a day, I don't care. If there's an LCBO OPSU member who gets paid a good wage and pays their union dues, you can sell liquor anywhere at any time, as far as I'm concerned.
Properly trained.
And who is properly trained, you can sell liquor anywhere, anytime, from my perspective. I'm not one of these moralists who feel it's bad we sell alcohol at 10:15 at night, and that will ruin society. I mean, that's more good jobs and more good hours for unionized people. That's my view. And I mean, I don't support alcohol being sold outside of publicly owned institutions. That's my view, including beer and wine in grocery stores, unless, as I've noted, it's done by unionized workers getting paid the same wage or greater than what workers at the LCBOs themselves make.
Okay. Iron Fire Horse wants to know, are we even going to be able to watch the debates and election without cable? Yes, you should be able to on the CBC website.
You should be able to, yeah. First of all, if you have, this is an option, but you know how like you can get digital antennae for your TV, and that allows you to capture like CBC, CTV, and I think like the big four American networks. Those are effectively free TV. Remember back in the olden days when, even if you didn't have cable with an antenna, you could usually get 5 or 6 channels. So there's that, but it should be run on the CBC website, maybe the CTV website. It should also probably be run on CPAC. I don't know about every single debate. So for example, that TVA debate might only be run on TVA. I'm not sure about all of them, but the 2 official debates should be available to everybody. And I believe, I assume that all of the debates should be translated into both languages, that there'll be a transcriber. So the French debate should be accessible to English people and vice versa. That's generally how it's worked with Canadian elections in recent years.
Okay. Homegrown Politics and Iron Fire Horse wants you to comment on the NDP's treatment of Palestinian rights.
Okay, this is always a tough one because, like, this issue gets more play than almost anything at our conventions, including like healthcare, public ownership, etc. My view is that Israel is largely the bad guy in this situation. That's my personal view. And I generally support the Palestinian position. So I'm a supporter of BDS. I'm certainly an opponent of trying to criminalize BDS. I'm a supporter of, that broad movement. So when I'm at those conventions, I vote with the rebels, quote unquote. Do I think it's a tier 1 issue? I don't know. I don't think so. Not from my perspective, but I do think it's an issue of human rights. And I do think that Israel is an apartheid state. And I think they're the bad guys. And I think something needs to change. And I am concerned that there is at times bleed outs from this legitimate position to anti-Semitism. But on the whole, Palestinians are having their basic human and political and economic and social rights violated, and it's wrong. And I wish the party was better on it. Our party being the least worst party on this isn't good enough. The NDP, for instance, is so when the Liberals effectively and the Conservatives wanted to almost criminalize BDS, like we're seeing in some parts of the USA, the NDP spoke out against that. But the NDP needs to be much clearer on this. And it is an issue that divides the party, not just like the rank and file from the establishment, but if you went to that Ontario NDP convention earlier this summer, shout out anybody who was there. Let me know. I know some of my viewers met me for the first time at that convention, but you'll see that the NDP MPPs stood with those people calling for us to take a stand with Palestine. And now MPPs and MPs have stood against us as well. So this is a really tricky issue for the party, but I know where I stand on it, which is generally in favor of Palestine's position.
Okay, Joshua Hunt. I've heard that the NDP might be losing seats due to a lack of returning incumbents. Do you think the party might have
have to do some regrouping after this election.
You okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the narratives, is that the NDP was losing a lot of incumbents and that was going to make it hard to win again. And I mean, generally, historically in elections, incumbents do well. Like the party that holds the seat has an advantage, and that advantage is greater when the person is running again, because the people know them. People like, there's an inertia in politics. It's like, well, I don't want to rock. If you don't want to rock the boat, you'll just vote for the guy or gal that's there right now. They're experienced and grizzled politicians, and they're often running against rookies. So there's that advantage. They have teams that know how to win. And so when you lose incumbents, it does make it hard. But I'm not necessarily convinced that it's as having the effect that a lot of people have suggested on the NDP. And there's a couple reasons. Is that some of the departures just make a lot of sense. And like, I'm not saying people can't run. I mean, I'm a Bernie Sanders guy, very old, but some of these people retiring are in their late 60s, early 70s. And it's not unreasonable for a person at that age to want to leave. So some people are suggesting that Linda Duncan in London, in Edmonton, was leaving because she has no faith in Jagmeet Singh. But it could easily just be the case that, like, she just wants to retire. And in some cases, there's been clear torch passings. In Hamilton Centre, Christopherson, who has been a longtime MP, and he could have given it another go and done a good job, but he saw that there was a young, exciting, candidate in Matthew Green who had these local ties and this real passion, and he stepped aside so that Matthew could run. So it's a tricky position. On the one hand, you want good incumbents that can win you seats. And on the other, though, you want exciting young candidates to bring new ideas and new energies. But what happens when those ideas clash? Sometimes you need these people to step aside to bring in the new blood. Now, of course, some of the other people have stepped aside for other reasons. Some have stepped aside to shift to provincial politics, and they've done so successfully. We see that with Malcolmson and Kennedy Stewart in British Columbia. People like Nathan Cullen, who isn't very old, I think are just taking a well-deserved break. I think you'll see them back. So certainly, you don't want to lose a big chunk of your candidates, everything else being equal, but it's not inherently a universal negative. There could be silver linings to it.
Okay. DJ Oaks Monroe says, what would happen if all the female teachers in Quebec decided to start wearing hijabs and headscarves as fashion statements, and all the men wearing skull caps and turbans?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what would happen. I would hope that, I would see it as a very powerful moment. And I think a lot of people would. I don't know what the long-term effects would be. Look, I think one of the challenges in Quebec right now is that Bill 21 is popular in Quebec. Not universally and not everywhere, but it's popular in Quebec. And the government that introduced that legislation, which was supported by other parties as well, not universally, but supported by other parties, is popular right now. And so it makes it hard to take a stance against it. And I don't know if the average Quebecois teacher supports Bill 21 or not. I actually don't know. So I think it would be a really powerful moment. And I think that it would be a real good sign of solidarity. And it would really put the government in an interesting position. Would they reprimand all these teachers? What would they do? If they didn't reprimand them, would that prove that their regulations are racially motivated? Because, say, tens of thousands of white teachers and civil servants started wearing religious garb, but weren't punished. And all of a sudden, though, individual Muslim women, Sikh men, what have you, were being, I would say that would not be a good look for the government. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but honestly, like, I'm visualizing it in my head, and I think it would be super interesting at the very least.
Well, wouldn't the government argue that wearing a headscarf not in relation to religion isn't a violation of the bill?
See, that's like, and I was actually thinking about that. That's a great point, Brie. Brianna said, like, basically, I'm just repeating sometimes because the mic is set to be cardioid, so it's like sometimes noises from the side can be a little. Brianna says, well, maybe you could argue that if it's clearly being worn for non-religious reasons, say as a political protest, maybe the law doesn't apply. But that gets really hairy as well, because couldn't every Muslim and Sikh person just say that, and then it would be at that point a matter of who do you trust is telling the truth, and then at that point does it become racially motivated again? So say white woman with an Anglo or Franco last name wearing a headscarf, it's clearly a political protest, she's good to go. Person with darker skin and a clearly quote unquote foreign last name wearing a headscarf, it's obviously religiously motivated, not good to go, and you end up with the same problem. But I think that's an interesting perspective.
Okay, Omar says, it looks like we have 3 progressive elections, UK, US, and Canada. If we lose all 3, what's our best hope for the issues? I think this is the last chance to fight climate change.
I mean, I agree that we're certainly approaching some kind of moment where we need to make positive progress. You know, in terms of the issues, though, I think we got to keep pushing on them, win, lose, or draw, because, and this isn't a consolation, you got to win. You got to win to implement your program. But you sometimes, losing doesn't invalidate your program all the time. As we know, Bernie Sanders lost in 2015, 2016. The process wasn't fair. But for the next 4 years, including now, Bernie Sanders has reshaped the very nature of the American political landscape. Not just one man, but Bernie Sanders and his movement have reshaped American politics, even though he lost. And I think fighting the issues is important. You don't want to disconnect them from politics, but you want to keep some breathing room there. So it's I've noted, for instance, on this channel, the NDP is the only party federally that supports a wealth tax. But a wealth tax is popular with 70% of Canadians, including a majority of Liberal, NDP, and Conservative voters. Probably Greens as well, although they didn't poll Greens, I think, specifically. That means that the issue of a wealth tax is popular. So even if the NDP loses this election, that issue isn't going away, and it could be brought back. So I think that's something to note. In terms of, is this the last election to fight climate change? I certainly think we're approaching that. And I think that urgency is very important, which is why I think that progressives need to continue to build that synergy between environmentalism and pro-worker ideology and pro-socialist ideology. Because that's, I think, the only way the left can get a winning coalition to implement the reforms needed economically and ecologically.
Okay, Dustin Brown says, will you be promoting and participating in the climate actions from September 20th to 27th?
I don't know if I'll be directly promoting or participating. I've been to some of the rallies in Kingston. I'll likely talk about it somewhat. On the channel, I've talked a bit on this channel about Greta Thunberg and the work that she's done, especially as it relates to her criticism of Justin Trudeau. So yeah, I'll probably have something on it, but I'm not exactly sure. It's sort of what I try to do on this channel is observe when I make my news videos. Of course, every once in a while, I'll make a video on video games, or I'll make a video on broader ideological questions, or I'll make a video related to the left tube commentary sphere. But when I make my mainline news analysis videos, I like to take a look at a story and see if I actually have something unique to say. Maybe not unique, because somebody else is thinking what I'm thinking somewhere in the world. But what's my hook? And so if I take a look at that story and I have a hook, you'll be sure to hear it on this channel.
Okay, Daniel Curella says, the NDP has been making me sad. How do we stop the implosion in the polls?
Well, the polls aren't necessarily imploding right now. That's the thing. There's a narrative about implosion right now that's convenient for the Liberals and Greens, but I don't necessarily buy it. Look, there was that Ecos poll that had us at 7.5. And I didn't like reading that poll either. But the next lowest poll for the NDP in August was Leger at 12. We were tied with the Greens there. There is no other polling company right now that did polls in August that has the NDP below the Greens. That's actually better than it was before. And the numbers for the Greens and for the NDP in August were the Ecos poll at 7, but then Leger at 12, another at 13, another at 14, another at 15, another at 17, another at 18. Now, those numbers at 12, 13, 14 are not great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not celebrating them. But I will remind people that there were polls for Jack Layton running up to 2011 that had him at 14 as well. Jack Layton, 3 weeks before the election in 2011, had some polls showing him below 15%. And again, people will say, well, Jack Layton had better favorability numbers than Jagmeet. And that's true. That's a fair point. But the Quebec wave was nowhere on the radar. Absolutely nowhere on the radar for Jack Layton 4 weeks out. Nowhere. And so to say that this election is over, I don't necessarily buy it. And if you want to look, the most recent poll, the one yesterday, had the NDP basically at about 16 points at Nanos. Now, that's lower than what Nanos had the NDP at a couple months ago, to be fair, but Nanos was the most accurate pollster in 2015, and they were the most accurate specifically at determining the NDP's end result. They predicted the NDP down to the 0.1% on the final result. So Nanos is one of the best pollsters, and they're showing the Liberals and the Conservatives sort of in a tie in the low mid-30s, and they show the NDP at about 16. Now, if the NDP finishes with 16 right now, that puts the party within the margin of error of 2015. Not great, but not doom and gloom. And about a result that's in consistency with the historical average. And further to all of that, the bigger question is, if we get 16 or 15 or 17 or whatever, the distributions could matter. This is one of the downsides. If the numbers in Quebec are to be believed, and there's more consensus there, that we are down in Quebec, then Jagmeet could end up with 18 or 19 and lose seats relative to Tom Mulcair, because if the vote just gets spread out evenly across English Canada and there's no pockets built up, we might gain votes in English Canada, but not enough to flip enough seats to make up for the losses in Quebec. That'll be a more tricky position where the NDP could end up with 19, the exact same amount as last time, and lose, say, 15 seats. That's going to suck, but it's not the doom and gloom scenario that people are projecting right now. At least not. And of course, who knows? Maybe Ecos is the correct poll. I hope to God it isn't, but maybe Ipsos that has the NDP at 18 is the correct poll. And maybe that's where we're at. We just don't know at this stage. The NDP's polling range is absurdly wide. It goes from 7.5 to like almost 20. That's almost a 3 times variance. And Ecos's numbers in Ontario have the NDP at like 6 in Ontario, but Abacus has the NDP at 22 in Ontario. If we're at 22 in Ontario, those are fantastic results, and we'll be picking up seats in Ontario at least. I honestly don't know what the polls are saying right now. All we can do is work hard to elect NDP candidates wherever they have a chance at winning.
Okay, another question from Andrei Borisenko, who is killing it with the questions today.
Thank you so much. Make our job a lot easier.
Political Divisions in 2006 and Beyond by Lee Drutman is an interesting breakdown of U.S. voters along socioeconomic lines. Do you know of a study like this for Canadian voters?
We don't have the same kind of studies for a few reasons. One, our media landscape and our academic landscape is smaller. So there's way more people to do way more studies in the U.S., whether it's about politics or anything else. There are like quite a bit of books written on Pierre Trudeau. Like I wrote one on him, but like there's like hundreds of books written about Abraham Lincoln, right? And hundreds of books written about George Washington and the other big U.S. presidents. The reality is, like, they just have a bigger landscape. And another factor, is a thing we don't do here in Canada, is exit polling. And they do this in Britain and the United States, which is that after people leave the voting booth, after they leave the polling station, companies like CNN, other polling firms, they will do exit polls, and they will ask people coming out, who did you vote for? And how old are you? What's your income? What's your education? What's your view on X, Y, and Z? And this is seen as more reliable data because by design, that person's coming out of a poll station. So you know they voted. Now, of course, they might be lying to you. That's possible. But that data is invaluable. And that was some of the data that showed us, for instance, that, in the days after the election, the narrative was that, Trump won because poor people voted against their economic interests for him and they voted against Hillary. And it's true that Trump did better amongst low-income people than Republicans usually do. But Trump, didn't win a majority of low and lower middle income voters. The Democrats won those. And so this is helpful because it gives you data to challenge preconceived notions about who's voting for who and why. In Canada, we don't have the same reliability of data. Although pollsters will at times, if you go into the polls, they will give you crosstabs. They'll give you regional numbers. They'll give you numbers by union status. They'll give you numbers by age. They'll give you numbers by income. They'll give you numbers by education. As we get into the election itself, you'll see more of this data. So for instance, like during the Ontario election, we learned, for instance, that the NDP did much better amongst women than it did amongst men, that the NDP did very well amongst both low income but high education people. And the Tories, the exact opposite. The Tories did not do, like, this narrative that poor people voted for Doug Ford is wrong. The poorest people voted overwhelmingly for the NDP. But wealthy people with low, like the richest people and people who have good incomes yet low educations, they voted for Doug Ford. Think about low, like people who have a good job despite the fact that they don't have a university degree. They vote for conservatives. And so it created this really interesting notion of the multi-dimensional nature of class. The NDP did very well amongst the highly educated and poor, but the conservatives did very well amongst the upper middle class without educations. And it creates this interesting dichotomy in that sense. And so I'm sure I get this polling data from the firms this time around, but not all firms do them on the same way and at the same frequency. And one of the challenges with this as well is that let's say you have a sample size of 1,000. That's a good sample. And on the broadest data, you can get a good sense for, who's going to vote for who. Some people don't trust polls, some people do, but it gives you a good sense. But when you start cutting that number into smaller and smaller pieces, then you start getting greater and greater margins of error. So let's say you say, poll 1,000 people, but then you want to find how specifically people in the Maritimes think. But the Maritimes only had 100 sampled in that sample of 1,000, which means that each individual person is has a crazy amount of influence and might skew the results. So those are another challenge of pollsters that ask a whole bunch of little questions, is that the narrower the question, the higher the uncertainty of that answer.
Okay, Ben McInnes has commented here that the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation is in every grocery store in Nova Scotia, that all the jobs are union jobs and you can't buy alcohol anywhere else. So it's exactly the model that
I like that. I like that. You go to the commission, Rand.
Okay, Adam B also suggests that CBC Gem is another app you can use to watch the election if you don't have a TV.
Oh yeah, CBC Gem. I haven't used that too much yet. I have it on my phone. It's sort of like a free Netflix, and it has like CBC TV on it, and it's like an app. Like you could sort of do it all on your phone anyway by going just to the CBC media player, but it's a cool little app, and I haven't put full use to it. So that's cool to know that the election will be on it.
Somebody write in the comments if I can watch the Great British Bake Off on it, because that's what I want, the Great British Bake Off. I'm just saying. Okay, Andre asks, Borisenko asks, thought on term limits for politicians. Do you think of this as a left, right, or just a niche issue? It's a right issue.
I don't support term limits. I'm of the view ultimately that the people can decide whether or not a person has had enough of a term. And the term limit is people don't want to vote for you anymore. That's my view. I'm not a supporter of term limits. I understand the rationale. Like the president is such a powerful job that to prevent a slippage into monarchy or tyranny, the president should have a 2-term limit. I get the argument, but I don't agree. I don't know if it's a left-wing or right-wing argument specifically. I think that some of these positions do become more right-wing. One of the arguments that politicians shouldn't get paid very well, or that politics should be like a volunteer job, I think is a right-wing position. Because although it sounds like it's like, you're trying to make it so that people aren't trying to get rich off politics, I think that if you don't make politics something that has a stability to it, only the wealthy can do it, or only like the spouses of wealthy people can do it. And I think that having politicians be able to build a career in their thing allows it to be the most accessible to those who we need to have in politics, those who couldn't be in politics if it was a gentleman's club. So in a sense, I see the rationale for term limits, but I do not support them. No.
Okay. So John Doe 6171 is testing me with this one. He says, heard some Scandinavian nations have no minimum wage, but unions are so empowered they get higher wages than the minimum wage law would give. Is this true? And if so, why does the US Canada left want higher minimum wage and not the Scandinavian model?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure of which specific Scandinavian countries do this or the details, so people do look this up, but I do know that is in general a correct point, that there are high unionization rates and sort of sectoral bargaining has created minimum wages that are more negotiated through unionization than exist through formal legislation. And in terms of like why that doesn't exist in Canada and the US, it's our labor movements were never quite as strong. And the country's labor movements were always more fractured. And I think that in Canada and the USA, capital would much rather have minimum wages than strong unions. I don't think that even, let's say labor would want to go towards a model of no minimum wages, but 80% unionization, and that gives people protection regardless. I think that it would be a very tricky position to convince people to go for, because it's like if you lost, would you lose minimum wages and collective bargaining? And so I think it's people see that minimum wages are required in some way. Another factor is that the minimum wage in Canada at least grew sort of gradually, and it started in the United States too. It started as protection for women. The argument of the minimum wage originally in Canada and the USA was that women were very difficult to unionize because they were often in the workplace temporarily, at least ideally. The hope was that once they got married and started having babies, they would go back to the home and be mothers and wives, and that women only worked temporarily. So because of that, there was a lot of them found that the stress of unionizing wasn't worth it. So in a sense, to protect these women, but also to raise their wages to discourage the use of female labor purely as a tactic of lowering men's wages, minimum wages were first created to apply to women. And only eventually over time they would apply to men. And so it was a sort of a gradual process that grew. And in some jurisdictions, like it was the 1960s when minimum wages became universal. I don't know if the answer is to move towards a purely bargained model, at least not right now, because the labor movement I don't think is strong enough to do that. And the nature of work in Canada is so fragmented right now that having a minimum wage is, I think, necessary to protect workers who have to move through so many different types of jobs, given the nature of like the precarious economy.
Okay, Drew M. Nice to see you again, Drew. Thanks for joining us. Says, Christo, would you prefer a more centralized or decentralized federal government?
I mean, I think Canada does strike a good balance. Like, you know, our provinces are not too strong, but not too weak. I would like to see some more federal power on certain issues. Healthcare would be a big one. In effect, healthcare is already so intertwined with federal politics because the provinces on their own would have a very difficult time funding healthcare. And so it's this weird scenario where it's provincial, but then the provinces need the federal money. So it's like the federal government is sort of responsible for the money of healthcare, but not for the administration of healthcare. And I wonder if the federal government playing more of a role in that process could be better. I do think, for instance, that a federal labor code would be good. One of the challenges for Canada right now is that it's very hard for labor activists to improve standards for workers coast to coast to coast because whether you're a federal or provincially mandated worker, or even if you're all provincial, if you're in Ontario versus PEI versus Manitoba, your wage rates and labor conditions will all be very different. How you unionize is very different. And I think that one national code would be good. But of course, I am cognizant of the fact that we're a very big country and a very diverse country in all sorts of ways, religiously, ethnically, linguistically, geographically, that perhaps that the too strong of a central federal government would lead to even more alienation than we see in certain regions. So I think that more power for the federal government would be my preference, but not a whole lot more power.
Ace wants to know any upcoming video games you're excited for.
It's a good one. Right now I'm playing WoW Classic right now, which is great. I'm glad I'm playing that again. You guys might have saw my video about that. Other games that I'm excited to try include, these are games that are not necessarily new, but I want to play the newest Football Manager when that comes out. I like that game. There's a Real Point 2 Point Hospital is something that I have on my Steam wish list. I've actually just been playing through The Witcher 3 for the first time, and I'm enjoying it at least a decent amount. So I'm playing through that. I'm excited to try Cyberpunk 2077 when that comes out next year. I think that's going to be super fun. It looks like Fallout, but even better. Those are the games I'm really excited for at the moment. And other games I'm playing. I've been playing Crusader Kings a bit lately. I'm a pretty big fan of Rocket League. I don't know if anybody here plays Rocket League. I feel like if I ever start streaming video games, I might at some point, try to do play video games and talk politics streams. And I feel like Rocket League would be a game I play a lot when I do that. I don't know if anybody plays that. It's car soccer for people who don't know.
Okay. Joshua Hunt says, do you think Bernie and his types will inspire the youth to care about politics? It feels that 40 years of voters didn't care about him until now.
I mean, Bernie Sanders has undeniably made young people more enthusiastic about politics. Will it be enough for him to win and win the presidency? I don't know. I think Bernie's gonna. I think I'm confident for Bernie. I don't know. Maybe it's just because I'm biased, but I think he's gonna do well in these primaries. But young people are undeniably part of that. Bernie Sanders, both in 2016, but also now, undeniably has gotten young people excited. If you look at the fact, back in 2016, there were only 2 people filling stadiums. Only 2 people were filling stadia. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And if you looked at Bernie's crowd, they were overwhelmingly young people. Often college-aged or in their 20s, maybe in their early 30s, what have you. And I think it's because, and I've noted this on the channel before, Bernie Sanders, both because he's an older guy, but because he's been a politician a long time, predates neoliberalism. He predates the neoliberal consensus that drove politics so far to the right, at least on economic terms. And these young people, unless they study history in university and know the history of America and the history of Canada, what have you, these young people know nothing but neoliberalism because their Gen X and Boomer parents know only liberal. Basically, as adults, lived most of their life through the neoliberal era, or at least the very, very start of the neoliberal era. And so Bernie Sanders goes to these young people and says, look, it doesn't have to be this way. And it's not even always been this way. Not only do I have bold new ideas, but I actually have some time-tested, good old ideas that we could bring back. Elizabeth Warren, to her credit, has done a little bit of this too. She said, look, I had a hard time going to university because my family didn't have money. But I was able to make it work because tuition at my school cost $100 a term. And even when you adjust for inflation, that's nothing. And she could pay for that on a waitress's salary. Waitresses today cannot pay for their university. Service workers can't. And I think these older politicians saying, look, it wasn't always this way, are showing young people that think a new world is possible with both good new and good old ideas. And I think Bernie Sanders has definitely done that. He has 100% inspired young people. And it's not only him, but Ocasio-Cortez and people like her, that wave of young left politicians, Bernie Sanders is going to go down in the history books as being a spark that lit that powder keg.
Okay, Joshua Hunt says, before I forget, congrats on reaching your Patreon goal. Will you add more channel-related Patreon goals?
Okay, yeah. So actually, thanks for bringing it up. Actually, so for those who don't know, I most of you are regular watchers. I do have a Patreon. It's just my name, Christo Aivalis. You Google that and Patreon, you'll see it. And I have a whole bunch of tiers, but I also had some broader group goals. The first one at $100 a month, which we met a couple months ago, was to have at least one monthly live stream. And now I've moved that up to twice a month minimum, which is something I've kept to since then. The next goal was at 250, which was to improve the audio visual quality of the channel. Now, what I've decided to do upon talking to some people with bigger YouTube channels is keep the same camera, but upgrade my microphone and buy a microphone with an external amp and an external boom. And it'll be a microphone that's very similar to what David Dole has, for those of you who watch the channel, which is a very big increase in quality of my microphone. And I'll probably purchase some external lighting. During the day, I'm very happy with my natural lighting in this space, but at night, I often get weird shadows. This is actually pretty good right now, but it's not always this good. So those are what I'm going to be doing. I don't have a direct timeline on that because I don't want to rush into buying expensive equipment, because some of the equipment can be expensive, until I've done a bit of research, but that's coming. The next goal is a bit of a, frankly, guys, if I'm being honest, it was kind of a joke goal because I didn't think I would ever get close to it. But I'm over halfway there now, and if I do hit it, I'm going to live stream in one sitting. Brianna might not agree with that part, but I'm going to live stream in one sitting playing the entirety of Earthbound, which should take me about 8 to 10 hours, I think.
You have got to be kidding.
Yeah, it's going to be fun, though. And we're going to do that when I hit $500 a month of monthly donations. The question is, what will I add in lieu of that? I might add an intermediary goal. I might add an intermediary goal of, like, say $350 a month or something, where I commit to doing, at least 1 or 2 interviews a month. I've been doing more and more interviews on the channel. You guys can let me know if you like them. I interviewed Brandon Tozo, who's an expert on American politics. I've interviewed Matthew Green, who's a NDP candidate in the upcoming election. I've interviewed Luke Savage, who's a podcaster, and he's a writer at Jacobin. And so I'm excited to interview more people, and I might make that a more formalized goal. Beyond that $500 goal, I mean, I don't know. I have to think about, like, if I hit $1,000 a month, we're getting to the point where, like, the channel's going to generate that's $1,000 a month American. That's approaching $15,000 a year Canadian. That's very good money, and I would have to look at how I could really start to professionalize the channel. And I haven't thought about it that far yet, and that's something I have to think about.
Okay. Adam B. writes, many newer Canadians are unfamiliar with the history of the NDP. Do you feel the NDP should do more to highlight the history of the party? How would you do so? And Davey Labor adds, thinks it's a good question, and says that he's met a ton of refugees who love the Liberals. Yeah, I mean, there's one of the challenges, and they've done polling on this before, it's that the party that was in power when you came to the country is often like the one you identify with. And so it's not surprising that the Liberals do very well amongst new Canadians, because whether it's refugees under Justin Trudeau or very recent immigrants, or whether it's the generation that came under the long Liberal leadership of Chrétien and Martin, that 93 to 2005 period, the Liberals have been in power more often than the Conservatives, and therefore you're more likely to have immigrated here when they were in power. And the Liberals have better outreach strategies in those communities. Now, the history of the CCF-NDP, I think, is a good one to bring up to people. I don't know if it's specifically going to appeal to refugees and new Canadians, but I think what the CCF-NDP history has shown time and time again is that the party is right before any other parties even start thinking about an issue. That when other parties weren't thinking about it, the NDP proposed healthcare. When other parties weren't thinking about it, the NDP talked about giving Japanese and Chinese Canadians the right to vote, and then Indigenous people the right to vote. When the War Measures Act happened, it was very popular at the time, but it's become more unpopular since. And Tommy Douglas took a stand against it. Whether it's Sven Robinson,
who became an early champion of, he wanted to include LGBTQ rights in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And nobody else in the conservatives and liberals who were on that charter committee supported him. Many New Democrats, if we're being honest, probably didn't support him either in the early 80s. It was a very different time. But there was a strong contingent of NDPers who championed gay rights at a time when it was very unpopular. And now it's common sense for like 70% of Canadians that gay rights are human rights. And that like the NDP should be proud of the fact and note consistently that our policies nowadays are often seen as radical or impractical or, or what have you. But 20, 30, 40 years later, people come around. And we should say, why add that extra step? Why not just let us make our positive changes now so that 20, 30, 40 years from now, we weren't wondering why we had to wait so long for healthcare or dental care or pharmacare. We can have those things now. I think maybe that's a good argument. And the history helps promote that. Specifically how to do that, I'm not sure. What policies to highlight, how to highlight them, which groups do you go to with these policies? But I think in general, the NDP has a proud history, both recent history, but also over the long term. So like, for instance, when the Liberals and Tories were both attacking one another over, Andrew Scheer's remarks about gay marriage. And then people brought up the fact that when Andrew Scheer said that, Ralph Goodale himself voted against gay marriage. And not enough media was bringing up the fact that in 2005, the NDP unanimously voted to legalize gay marriage, with the exception of one MP, and Jack Layton would not sign her papers next time, and she would be replaced by Nikki Ashton. And so I think like in a sense, we took that bold stand when liberals and conservatives were divided on the issue. And I think Canadians, like if you're a marginalized Canadian, you have to say, who's going to stand with me now, even if it's unpopular? The NDP. And the liberals, they'll come around when the polling comes around, but not a moment sooner.
Okay, Barry Lamont says he's working as a canvasser for the NDP this weekend. Any suggestions for a newbie?
Couple things. I'm not an expert canvasser, so I don't want to pretend like I'm a canvasser extraordinaire. I'm more of a phone guy personally. But one piece of advice that applies to the phone and the door is efficiency matters. And if you don't get into arguments with people, try to get your information and get to the next door. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a list of people who are definitely going to vote for you, who are definitely not going to vote for you, and who might be voting for you. And you want to get that data because, once you start going through your second and third goes, you want to be able to build a database of people who you can pull the vote for on election day. Simple as that, right? That's what it's about. You're not really canvassing to convert people. I mean, maybe if the candidate is around, maybe you can do that, but that's something key to note, right? One, it's a lot easier. And
a special canvas team will go out to convert those
yeah.
people.
And if somebody's you can say, well, if you have a specific concern, I can give you the candidate's phone number and you can call them, or you can give me your phone number and the candidate will reach out to you. And then that way you can get to the next door and go. Another thing is don't do things you're not comfortable with, right? If you feel uncomfortable in a situation, protect yourself, right? We're a labor party. And even if you're a volunteer or even if you're a paid canvasser, you have rights as workers, and I don't want people putting themselves in uncomfortable situations. Another is have a script, follow your script generally, but also if you find something works for you to be more efficient or more effective, trust your gut as well, right? Trust your gut with these sorts of things. Other than that, those are the basics. Work in teams with people. Take notes of what people are saying. Because our general lists, the one, for those who don't canvass, a one means they're a very likely NDP voter. They might take a sign, they might donate, they might volunteer. A two is they could vote for us. And then there's threes, which is unlikely, fours are not. But they might tell you, I'm not voting for you, I'll never vote for you, I'm voting for the Conservatives. Or they might tell you that okay, I'm not voting for you, but it's because of strategic voting. And you should note the differences. Because let's say the polling starts to improve for the NDP, and now we're the strategic option, quote unquote. You want to know who told you strategic voting was their motivation and hit those people up. And if you can collect that data, then the campaign staff in the office can build different lists of people, at least ideally.
Yeah, and I would add, simple things like check the weather report. So, if it's going to be sunny and you need sunscreen and a hat, bring it. Wear comfortable shoes. You're going to be outside for like 3 or 4 hours. So bring water. Bring a canvas bag that you can put your literature and your clipboard in. You might want to bring a pen that works, because all pens in campaign offices die. I have no idea why. And other than that, what Christo said.
Yeah, I mean, what you want to do is also have a bunch of cards available. If people aren't there, drop them in the mailbox. Sometimes what people do is they'll you can leave, like, if a candidate's around, especially candidates sometimes leave like specialized notes saying they visited, things like that. So, you want to make sure that even if they're not home, people know you stopped by their house because they like that.
Adam B says you can watch the Great British Bake Off on that app.
Nice.
That's really good.
Nice. It's good to know. Thank you. Thank you. You just made Brianna's night. I actually like British Bake Off too. So this is not one of the things where now I have to watch a show I don't like. It's a really good show. Also the Canadian one, like the Great Canadian Bake Off, not as good, but it's still pretty good.
Okay. Claudia Holding says, I always feel that politicians make promises during campaigns that they don't intend to keep. How can we guarantee they'll implement what they say they will?
Well, Claudia, unfortunately, I don't know if you can. I think here's one thing, and they have this in certain parts of the USA, and I believe British Columbia is the only province, is that you could have recall legislation. You could have legislation that allows, constituents to recall their MP if the MP lied to them or is now acting in a way that they don't feel represents the riding. And certain U.S. states, for certain offices, and you have to fulfill certain conditions, you could have recall legislation. I'm not exactly sure where I stand on that, but I'm not opposed to it. But implementing something like that's going to take some work and some time. I think a big factor that won't guarantee promises are kept, but would increase the likelihood, is minority governments. Minority governments will ensure that that when promises are broken, they're more likely to be broken because the party doesn't have the level of support they need to pass the legislation. But for instance, I can think of a scenario where in 2015, the election happened 4 days earlier. And Justin Trudeau won the election, but the NDP had a clear hold on the balance of power because the Liberals lost about 10 of those seats and they went to the NDP. So the Liberals were at like 160 and the NDP were like at 50. And that's not unreasonable. The NDP lost a lot of close seats to the Liberals. And in that moment, the NDP could have said to the Liberals and said to all the people who voted Liberal, look, our goal is to keep Justin Trudeau accountable to his own promises. And Justin Trudeau would have found it much harder to break his electoral reform promise if he made the promise and then had the NDP and Elizabeth May, she probably would have been a solo MP, and maybe the Bloc even as well, basically telling him that he has to keep that promise. It would be a much greater chance of promises being kept, I think. But other than that, I don't know. I think you just I think that you have to look at which politicians are most likely to keep their promises. And I think another factor is that a promise that fits the ideological goal of that party? So if the Liberals make a promise that all of a sudden seems really, really progressive, you might say there's a chance they're lying. Maybe they're not. Maybe they'll surprise us. But it's like if the NDP promises to implement dental care, I think there's a very strong likelihood it'll happen. If Justin Trudeau does, it may well be a lie. That's just and maybe that's me being biased, but it's like the Liberals have a motivation to get progressive votes and then win a majority and then hope 4 or 5 years later we've all forgotten. That's what Justin Trudeau did with electoral reform. So far it's worked for him, which is sad, right? But who knows what'll happen.
Okay, Drew M., I see your question on Canadian content, but I don't quite get it. So if you could rewrite it and resubmit it, that would be great. I'd love to read it. Call the Legend says, my man Christo, we definitely need a federal labor code. No more $6 an hour contracts at Domino's. That must be in the States.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
that's just criminal.
Is that in the States, or is that a just eat thing? I mean, the thing in this, because in the States they do have a federal labor code. This is the thing. The United States has a federal minimum wage, and it actually applies to all workers. The U.S. federal minimum wage is $7 something an hour. And so if a state has a higher minimum wage, it's higher than that. And some states do have a higher minimum wage. Some cities have $15 minimum wages in the USA. But if it's lower, it automatically gets pegged to the federal minimum wage. In Canada, a federal minimum wage only applies to workers under federally regulated industries. That includes employees of the federal government, but it also includes people that work on the railways, people that work in the banks, people that work at airports. There's a whole bunch of different industries that are affected. People that work in the military, things like that, that it applies to. But it doesn't apply to, say, workers at the municipal and federal and provincial levels of the various provinces. In the U.S., that's not the case. Bernie Sanders becoming president could reform the entirety of the USA's labor code if he can get the support in the Congress to do so. Of course, those are both big ifs, but he could do it. Jagmeet Singh becoming prime minister with a majority in Canada could not overrule minimum wages in the provinces. We just don't have that power here, given our constitution.
Okay, Patrick Ranjan says that he's watching all the way from Mississauga, and
okay, it's good. Great.
Yeah,
not that far. I was
I was reading it like Missouri.
Missouri or like St. John's, Newfoundland. I was like, no, Mississauga. That's like 3 hours away.
I'm like Mississauga. I watch a lot of political news, and there's not enough news about Canadian politics on the internet, and he wants everyone to vote Jagmeet. But he also has a question. What do you think about Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard together?
I like Bernie a lot. Like if I was an American, I would 100% be supporting Bernie Sanders and volunteering for him and giving him my money and making even more videos about Bernie than I already do if I was an American. In terms of Tulsi Gabbard, so Tulsi Gabbard has some great views, and then she has some things that are concerning to me. Like her positions, her ties to Modi, I don't really like. She has had some recent transformations on things like gay marriage, which aren't good enough for me because Bernie has been good on that issue since before I was born. I wouldn't have her as Bernie's VP pick. I understand the appeal. She's something of a progressive, and she is a young woman of color, and that gives a good counterbalance to Bernie. I get like why I would like ideologically a Bernie Warren ticket, but I get why it doesn't make sense for Bernie Sanders to pick another old white person also from the New England area. Doesn't make sense. I think Bernie Sanders, if he becomes the nominee, will have to pick a woman and would likely pick a young woman at least, and preferably somebody who is not white. And that would help excite the base and would counterbalance the claims that and picking somebody young would be important. I don't know if Tulsi Gabbard is that person. A lot of people are suggesting, even though she's not really like a formal office holder right now, are Nina Turner, who's one of Bernie's like campaign people. And she is exhilarating to hear. It's exhilarating to hear her speak. I don't know if they'll pick Nina Turner, but I think like that would be very exciting. He might surprise us and go as somebody sort of moderate. What about Bernie Sanders picking Stacey Abrams from the South, a black woman from the South? I don't know. Maybe Bernie's going to think that the VP pick isn't about as ideology as much as it is about identity and about the politics of the base. So I'm not sure about that relationship, and I think that's a really key issue right now about where Bernie's going to go. So Tulsi, I mean, she's better than the average Democrat, but I don't know if I rank her as high on my list as, say, Elizabeth Warren. I would pick Warren before Gabbard.
Okay, Barry Lamont asks, can I get your views on taking the politics out of the charter?
I mean, in what sense? I'll give but like, let me know if I'm hitting the right points. I mean, the charter in a sense exists to sort of depoliticize certain types of legislation. I mean, that's why, because, before the charter, we had human rights legislation in this country. In 1940s, Tommy Douglas and the CCF passed a human rights code. And in the 1960s, I believe, John Diefenbaker and the Progressive Conservatives passed a human rights code. But those were just bills in the House. And they could be overturned by the next government with a simple up and down vote with one more yes than no. And that's too precarious a position for basic human rights. So in terms of the charter being politicized, I'm not sure what you mean. I'd like to know a little bit more.
Yeah. So Barry, if you could just maybe write your question out again, we'd be happy to answer that.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll come back. I'll make sure to come back to it if you write it.
Yeah, because I want to.
Okay. Jacob Hendren, are you in favor of high-speed rail from Quebec City to Windsor, e.g. Quebec, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, London, Windsor?
Well, you got to throw Kingston in there, and then yes. Yes, I do support that. I don't know like the specifics, whether Quebec City is going to be should be part of it, or whether it's Montreal to Windsor or what have you. Like, there are experts who could do an analysis of the capacity and the logistics and all of those sorts of things. But in general, I like the idea of high-speed rail. I don't know if coast-to-coast high-speed rail is something that Canada has the density for. Like, we're not Europe. We don't have 40 million, 50 million people in something the size of Saskatchewan or half the size of Ontario or what have you. We just don't have that density. So I think though that high-speed rail network linking Montreal, Quebec down to Windsor or down to Niagara, connecting it into the big U.S. cities like Detroit and Chicago, I think building in like in the industrial belt. High-speed rail should be a priority. And I assume it should be a priority as well in, down the U.S. seaboard, Boston, New York, Philly, Washington, D.C., even like the dense population on the U.S. border, I think is something that is sorely needed.
Okay. Ace wants to know, does anyone here know any good left-wing discords like sources?
Discords. I'm not sure about discords. I mean, other people in the Discord for me is mostly, it's a gaming related. It's mostly gaming channels. There's some good like left-wing Facebook groups, a lot of good meme groups. Leftist memes for New Democrat teens is a really good one. Which is one where I am a frequent poster. You'll often see me there posting memes and sharing memes. There's a lot of good subreddits. Canada Left is a good subreddit. For those who don't know, BreadTube is a good subreddit for YouTube content on of a left-wing variety. Non-sectarian includes the revolutionary left, includes democratic socialist myself, includes people maybe more to the center, but everyone is definitively not small L liberal, right? And it's like this good source for coverage of economic and social and political issues from the left. And there's a ton of good left-wing subreddits that are out there, but I'm not sure about the discords.
Okay, Joshua Hunt says, would you consider doing weekly Wednesday live shows with a marketing push to get your left message out?
Yeah, Joshua, I don't know if you were here at the beginning. It was when we were just starting. Not next week, but the week after is my next scheduled Wednesday live stream. And then from that point onward, I don't know if we can get the date of that, but from that point onward, I'm going to do weekly Wednesdays until at least the end of the Canadian election. So I think like 2 weeks from now is the what is that, the 21st or something? I don't know. What is it? Like from that point onward, I'm going to do that every week until the end of the election. And I believe there's a Wednesday on the 23rd of October, which will be 2 days after the election, where I'll sort of do a recap episode. And then after that, I'll reevaluate whether or not I'll be doing weekly podcasts or not, depending on how many people show up, the interest you guys show. Do I feel like I'm getting, are you guys tapped out for questions if I do them every week? And that or do you guys really want me and need me to be here answering questions and talking with y'all? So at least until the end of the election, I know there's going to be a ton of things to talk about. And after that, we'll reevaluate.
September 25th.
September 25th, I believe, is the next.
Is when you're going to start your weekly session.
Yeah, so that 2 weeks from now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Claudia Holding asks, maybe you could do analysis of left publications which are good to follow. And you have a list, right?
I did. I put up a list on social media. I could do a YouTube comment post. I want to limit those because I find that people sometimes complain that the community posts, clutter their feed. But I could certainly put one together, go and find that list and put a community post up of like left-wing sources to read specifically about Canada. I had I think 10 or so. Certainly there's more than that, but those were like 10 or so that I find myself reading frequently, or I have contributed to, or both.
Okay. Laura was here says, what would be some cons to recall legislation?
Well, some cons are that it could be used as a cudgel against politicians that are taking tough stands that are important. I think cloudies the fact that depending on the nature that the people, if people are following their mandate, it makes politicians, I think, more election focused than they are legislative focused. And this is one of the criticisms I have of the U.S.'s 2-year Congress. Every 2 years they have to elect their House means effectively you're never not campaigning. Whereas in the Senate, maybe 6 years is too long, but you don't have to be in perpetual campaign mode, at least for your own seat. Again, other factors could recall processes be influenced by moneyed interests? I think that's possible, especially if recalled interests affect a local riding. So, for instance, could a big oil company target a anti-oil sands MP by funding a recall campaign in their riding, putting anti-media out there? It gives that greater sense. Now, of course, it could also be argued that we could use recall legislation against bad politicians, but those are some arguments that people will make as a con. Some people have a different philosophy of government. Some people have a philosophy which is that you elect your representative, and if they make promises to you, they should keep them. But beyond that, they should be allowed to make decisions for what they feel is best. And recall legislation would hamper their ability to do that. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's an argument against recall.
Okay, Laura was here also says, Bernie Warren would be amazing. Does age really matter to people that much?
I don't know if age matters to people that much. I think, but and maybe this is like conventional politics, and maybe I'm just like, because I've done a lot of history, I get stuck thinking about the way it's always been done. But I mean, generally, you want to pick someone who's different from you from vice president because they can help you reach different groups. And besides the fact that Bernie and Warren have different views, and Warren is a woman, and that would be significant. She's from a New England liberal state, like a left-leaning state. She's seen as a left-leaning candidate, and she's also quite old. Her and Bernie are seen as very similar. Whereas if Bernie was to, say, pull somebody from the South or from the moderate wing, or to pull a younger person, or to pull a person of color, I think that might be a greater divergence. It's the same thing, like Joe Biden shouldn't pick another moderate. Joe Biden should not pick John Delaney, both because John Delaney is awful. But even if John Delaney was good, it doesn't reach new people, right? Like even Mitt Romney picked Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan was picked because he was young and he fit a different base in the Conservative Party. He was more associated with the Libertarian wing. And even Donald Trump, he picked Mike Pence. Donald Trump picked Mike Pence because the fact is that Donald Trump got the support of the evangelicals during the general, but a lot of them were skeptical about him. By picking a clear evangelical Christian like Mike Pence and picking somebody with mainstream political credibility, aka somebody who's a governor of at least a mid-sized state, he could demonstrate that he had credibility. That's what it mattered there. So it's like it's demographics, it's ideology, it's location, it's insider versus outsider status. And I have no idea what Bernie's planning, but the conventional wisdom is that a Bernie Warren ticket would be two candidates who are too similar. Another factor is, let's say Bernie Sanders wins the nomination. Does Elizabeth Warren want to be vice president? Well, vice president is not as important a position as maybe being a progressive senator who's pushing Bernie's agenda. Or maybe she wants to have a position in the cabinet, a direct position, like to be a secretary of a very important department. I don't know. If Bernie wins, he probably would approach Elizabeth Warren to be on his team. But the question is, what role would she want to play?
Okay. Adam B says, do you think changing our immigration point system to better incentivize growth in cities that could use it, like Kingston, and northern communities and the East Coast, is a good idea?
That's an interesting question. I mean, one of the notes of the immigration system, long history is for a long time, Canada didn't have a point system. It was, you are from the right country with the right religion, the right stock, you're in. Or you're from one of the southern European countries, I guess we'll take you. We do need some manual labor. Or it's like, you're from these countries, and unless you're exceptional, or we're forced to do it, we're going to take almost none of you. With the point system, we started granting immigration status much more by merit. That's a good thing. One of the challenges of Canada's immigration system, though, is that our Charter of Rights and Freedoms makes it so that once you're a citizen, the government can't tell you where to live. They can't force you to live in a certain city or a certain province or a certain region. So it's been very difficult for Canadian authorities to get immigrants to come to Canada and then stay in certain locales. They're often happier moving to certain communities, at least for a while. And often when new generations come in, those generations will move out. My dad, for instance, immigrated to Canada and lived, like many Canadians, lived in Toronto. And over time would eventually move to the Maritimes, which is where I was born, where he met my mother, right? And like that was like a generational process that took him 20 years to do. And so in some ways, I think I'm not sure how we can use our point system to do that. You could ask immigrants, where do you plan to settle? And if they suggest they're willing to settle and have employment in less demand communities, say the Maritimes, say Northern Ontario, say, basically anywhere that's not Montreal, or anywhere that's not Toronto and Vancouver, let's say, then you get more points. But what's to say that person doesn't just, once they get their status, once they become citizens, they can go wherever the hell they want, and rightfully so. So I don't know if we have a tool to encourage immigration to stay in these cities that need the most. I don't know if we have a solution. I mean, the government could offer positive incentives. The government could, for instance, put more public servant jobs in small communities outside the big cities, outside the big provinces. But I don't think they can force people to live somewhere, even if they're immigrants.
Well, and on that last note, when I was in Nova Scotia on the Governor General Leadership Tour, Nova Scotia as a province is encouraging settlement for refugees and immigrants to live and stay in Nova Scotia because of their declining population. So they are, through social programs and resettlement options, encouraging people to not only, initially move to Nova Scotia, but to stay there.
Yeah, and Brianna brings up a great point. That's a great point. Provinces and cities can play a role. If you want, you could play a role in many ways. So, for instance, Quebec right now is complaining they can't get enough workers and they need more immigrants to get the employment rate up. They want employers don't want low unemployment rates because then they have to give workers good wages. So if a city or a province was to raise their minimum wage higher, it might encourage more people to come. As Brianna notes, better social programs, but not just social programs, but better community integration programs can be helpful. And perhaps the federal government could partner, maybe say like cost splitting with provinces and municipalities that are willing to implement programs that don't just welcome new Canadians to come here as they get settled, but to stay there and raise their families there. And maybe that's something that the provinces and cities and federal government could work on together.
Okay, Craig Adolph says, just tuning in. Don't forget to shout out the Manitoba NDP. Last opportunity for advanced voting is tomorrow night, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. You can vote from any advanced voting location, no matter where you live.
Craig, thanks for that. Craig is one of my patrons, but Craig is also working on one of the riding level campaigns in Manitoba. I believe he's the campaign manager of a campaign, and he's doing great work. That election is going to be a very interesting one. I mean, the polls right now at the top level look very good for the PCs, as bad as that is. It's not too surprising because the Manitoba NDP governed for basically a generation up until a couple years ago. So often when governments get elected once, they often get elected at least twice. It's rare that governments lose after their first term. But the encouraging sign is the NDP numbers are up. The Conservative numbers are way down from where they were 4 years ago. And Manitoba is such an interesting province electorally. In Manitoba, the vast majority of the population basically lives in and around Winnipeg. More than any other province, Winnipeg, one city determines the result of an entire province. Because even in like Halifax plays a big role in Nova Scotia, but I don't think as big of a role as Winnipeg plays in Manitoba. And so it can be the case that the Conservatives could beat the NDP by 4 or 5 points in the general vote, and the NDP could still win a majority if the NDP does very well in Winnipeg. And I'm not a big fan of first past the post, but it has worked very well for the NDP because in Manitoba, the Conservative Party dominates the rural parts of the province. Often they win ridings with 60, 70% of the vote, but those votes are wasted. And if the NDP can win various city ridings in Winnipeg by a few hundred votes here or there, they can win the election with a majority government despite not winning the popular vote. And that could happen this election.
Okay, so Joshua Hunt says, for sure do weekly live streams. There'll always be questions and news to comment on. So vote of confidence for you there.
Thank you so much.
And James Gardner says, I'm not sure if anyone has asked this. And no, they haven't, James. But how likely do you think the Labour Party is to vote for an election? If they do, what do you think Corbyn's chances are?
I mean, that's an interesting one. From what I've read a little bit about this today, but I haven't read up. And you know how quickly things are moving in England. So I haven't read things in about 4 or 5 hours about this. So if this is based on breaking news, I might be out of date. My inkling is right now, at least, Corbyn wants to get no deal off the table before the election. And I think it's because that is something that will be something that gives him credibility as saying that he's against no deal. And I think that it's something that he knows he can get past, and that prevents a no deal Brexit. Now, a lot of people have suggested that Jeremy Corbyn is skeptical of the EU, and I think he is, but Corbyn has never wanted a no deal Brexit. Corbyn campaigned on Remain this time around, and Corbyn is not a supporter of a no deal. And I think what he's doing is he's putting the country's interests above all, and he wants that no deal. Now, I don't know though, because a couple days ago, Boris Johnson said he didn't want an election, and now since he lost that vote in the House, effectively stripping him of some of his powers, now he wants an election. And I'm not sure where Corbyn is on the issue at this very moment, but it seems to me that there is a desire to try to get something of a no deal. Get no deal pushed aside and then move on to an election. But Boris Johnson might not want that, and he might want to go to an election feeling like he can win a mandate on a no deal Brexit. And if that's the case, we might go to an election. But then again, does Boris Johnson have enough votes to suspend Parliament? If he goes to the Queen and asks to suspend the Parliament, asks to dissolve it, would the Queen give Jeremy Corbyn a chance to govern first? I don't know. And could Corbyn say, I have enough between myself and all of the rebels, the Lib Dems and the Scottish Nationals and the Conservatives that have effectively left the Conservative Party because of Boris Johnson's support for no deal. I can govern long enough to end no deal as an option, and then we're going to call an election. And like that might be an option there too. But it's really like right now it's 3 a.m. in England, so I'm guessing the news is quiet. But I'm guessing, in the next couple hours, there's going to be even more craziness happening. If anybody has more up-to-date details, please note them in the comments.
Okay, and that's all for tonight.
Okay, so is that all the questions?
Yep.
Excellent. Guys, thanks so much for coming by. I really appreciate it, like always. So again, not next week. Next week we're off for scheduled live streams. Again, I believe there's a U.S. debate sometime next week or the week after. I might go live after that for the next big U.S. debate, but not next week, but the week after, we'll be doing our live stream. And then from then on, it'll be every Wednesday until at least the end of the federal election. After that, we'll reevaluate and we'll see if we go weekly at that point. But at the very least, we'll only revert back to the bi-weekly schedule. So we'll go back to normal. And then maybe as the Democratic primary actually starts voting, in January, February, I'll move back to a weekly schedule then as well. But I might just continue weekly throughout the whole thing if there's interest. Any last questions, comments? Nothing?
Thank you and goodbye.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Oh.